We've spent 4 episodes pulling back the curtain on policy duality, those gaps between what policies promise and what they deliver, between who they claim to serve and who actually benefits. If you've been feeling a bit discouraged, I don't blame you. The mechanisms we've uncovered are deeply entrenched, often invisible, and remarkably effective at maintaining power imbalances. But I didn't bring you this far just to leave you in despair. Welcome back to Behind the Policies, Understanding Duality in Modern Governance. I'm your host, and today we're turning our attention to potential responses, the strategies and approaches that might help us design more equitable policies. Not perfect solutions, mind you. There's no magic wand for dismantling centuries of power dynamics, but promising pathways toward governance that more genuinely serves broader interests instead of simply claiming to. If policy duality thrives in shadows, then transparency mechanisms are our first defense. Public audits that specifically track who benefits from policies, not just how money is spent, but who ultimately receives those resources, can reveal hidden advantages built into seemingly neutral designs. These distributional audits go beyond traditional oversight by examining outcomes across different population segments, making patterns of elite capture more visible. Denmark's approach offers an instructive example. Their open data initiatives specifically track policy benefits by income quintile, geographic region, and industry sector, creating what they call equity impact statements for major legislation. When their 2019 climate transition funding was revealed to disproportionately benefit large corporations over smaller firms and households, public pressure forced a reallocation of resources. This kind of radical transparency doesn't guarantee equitable outcomes, but it does make inequitable ones harder to hide and defend. Digital technologies offer particularly promising tools for enhanced accountability, if designed with that specific purpose. Researchers at the Governance Lab have developed policy tracing platforms that visualize the full implementation chain of public programs, making it easier to identify where resources get diverted or where certain communities face higher barriers to access. When applied to housing assistance programs in 3 major U.S. cities, these tools revealed that application processes contained an average of 27 more administrative steps for residents of lower-income neighborhoods compared to more affluent areas, a disparity not visible in the formal policy design. Similarly, blockchain-based tracking of public contracts in several Latin American countries has exposed patterns of what researchers call proximity bias, where government contracts consistently flow to firms with personal connections to officials, despite procurement rules designed to prevent such favoritism. By making these patterns visible, digital accountability tools can help close the gap between policy intentions and outcomes. Perhaps most promising are accountability mechanisms that build in citizen oversight from the start. Participatory auditing programs, where randomly selected citizens receive training and authority to monitor policy implementation, have shown remarkable success in reducing elite capture. In Indonesia's Participatory Road Project Monitoring Initiative, communities with citizen auditors saw approximately 34% less material diversion and significantly higher quality infrastructure compared to similar communities without such oversight. What makes this approach effective isn't just the monitoring itself, but its random selection component, which disrupts established patronage networks. Similar approaches in education and healthcare delivery have demonstrated that when citizens have real authority to demand explanations, not just file complaints that disappear into bureaucratic black holes, officials become more responsive to broader constituencies. These models suggest accountability works best when it's not just about transparency, but actual consequences, when those implementing policies know they're being watched by people with both knowledge. If policies disproportionately serve elite interests partly because elites have disproportionate input in their design, then broadening participation offers a logical counterbalance. Digital tools have created new possibilities for participatory governance by reducing traditional barriers to involvement. Madrid's Decide platform exemplifies this potential. When launched in 2015, it allowed citizens to propose, debate, and vote on policy initiatives through a digital portal designed specifically to be accessible across different education levels and technical abilities. Participatory budgeting initiatives using similar platforms in cities worldwide have demonstrated promising results in producing more equitable resource allocations. Research comparing traditional versus digitally enhanced participatory budgeting across 12 cities found that the latter resulted in approximately 41% more funding directed to previously underserved neighborhoods. This shift occurred largely because digital platforms enabled participation from citizens who couldn't attend in-person meetings due to work schedules, care responsibilities, or mobility constraints, groups traditionally excluded from policy conversations. However, simply creating digital participation mechanisms doesn't automatically produce equitable engagement. Design choices matter tremendously. When Taiwan developed its V1 platform for citizen input on technology regulation, they specifically engineered it to prioritize consensus building rather than polarization. The platform uses what they call opinion clusters that visualize areas of agreement across different stakeholder groups rather than amplifying disagreements. This design encourages participants to build on points of consensus rather than retreating to ideological corners. Similarly, the Polis platform used in several Scandinavian countries employs algorithms designed to identify and highlight perspectives that bridge divides rather than the most extreme or emotionally provocative views. These approaches stand in stark contrast to commercial social media platforms that often boost divisive content for engagement purposes. They demonstrate how thoughtful design can help participatory technologies serve their stated democratic aims, rather than reproducing existing power dynamics or creating new forms of manipulation. The most successful participatory governance approaches also recognize that technology alone cannot overcome deep structural inequalities. Barcelona's hybrid model combines digital participation with targeted analog outreach in underrepresented communities. Their Digital Democracy Delegates program provides both technology access and facilitation support in neighborhoods with historically low participation rates. Evaluations of this approach found that it increased participation from lower-income and immigrant communities by approximately 67% compared to purely digital approaches. Similarly, Brazil's sustainability planning framework requires that participation metrics be disaggregated by income, race, gender, and geography, with minimum thresholds for diverse representation. If these thresholds aren't met, additional outreach is mandated before decisions can be finalized. These hybrid approaches acknowledge that meaningful participation requires addressing not just technical access, but deeper barriers of time, confidence, and perception of efficacy. They suggest that while technology can enhance participation, it must be paired with intentional strategies to reach those most often excluded from policy conversations. As we've explored throughout this series, narrative framing plays a crucial role in policy duality. Policies that disproportionately benefit elites are typically wrapped in universalist language that makes them difficult to critique without appearing to oppose broadly shared values. Countering this dynamic requires developing what some scholars call narrative accountability, the capacity to recognize and question the stories that accompany policies. Finland's approach to this challenge offers an instructive model. Their national education curriculum includes mandatory media and policy literacy that specifically teaches students to identify narrative techniques in policy presentations. Students learn to recognize framing devices like false dichotomies, hero-villain constructions, and crisis language that might be used to fast-track policies with minimal scrutiny. Evaluations show that students receiving this education are approximately 42% more likely to identify potential duality in policy proposals, and significantly more likely to ask critical questions about who benefits from specific implementation mechanisms. This approach doesn't promote cynicism about all policies, but rather encourages informed skepticism, a crucial distinction for healthy democratic engagement. Beyond formal education, several promising initiatives focus on what researchers call just-in-time media literacy, tools, and resources that help citizens evaluate policy narratives at the moment they encounter them. The Policy Frame Check browser extension, developed by a consortium of universities, analyzes news coverage of policy announcements and highlights potential narrative techniques that might obscure distributional impacts. When tested during coverage of recent infrastructure legislation, users reported being 57% more likely to consider who might be excluded from benefits and 63% more likely to seek out information about implementation details rather than accepting top-line descriptions. Similarly, public media initiatives like Beyond the Headline provide rapid response analysis that specifically examines the gap between policy framing and mechanics. These approaches recognize that narrative accountability requires both general skills and specific, timely information about particular policies, especially given the speed of modern media cycles that can make critical perspectives seem like old news if they arrive too late. Perhaps most promising are collaborative approaches to narrative accountability that leverage collective intelligence. Taiwan's COFAX platform enables citizens to submit questionable policy claims for community fact-checking and narrative analysis. Unlike traditional fact-checking that focuses narrowly on verifying specific statements, COFAX encourages contributors to identify narrative patterns and potential framings that might conceal policy duality. The platform has been particularly effective at identifying what researchers call truth sandwiches, where technically accurate statements are arranged to create misleading impressions about policy impacts. Similarly, Germany's Narrative Watch initiative combines professional analysis with crowdsourced observations to track how policy narratives evolve over time and identify potential disconnects between framing and implementation. These collective approaches recognize that narrative accountability is too complex and context-dependent for either purely algorithmic or purely individual approaches. They suggest that building resilience to manipulative policy framing requires both technical tools and human communities dedicated to more transparent narrative environments. While transparency, participation, and narrative accountability can help address policy duality from the outside, institutional design principles offer approaches for building more equitable governance from within. Representation quotas provide one straightforward mechanism for ensuring diverse perspectives in policymaking. Chile's constitutional drafting process offers an instructive example. Their assembly included guaranteed positions for indigenous representatives and required gender parity, resulting in substantially different priorities in the resulting draft. Research comparing similar bodies with and without such requirements found that representative bodies produced policies with approximately 37% more equitable distribution of benefits across different population segments. Of course, representation alone doesn't guarantee equitable outcomes. Token inclusion without actual influence can provide the appearance of diversity while maintaining elite control. But thoughtfully designed quotas that include specific authority and resources, not just symbolic presence, can help realign institutional incentives toward more broadly beneficial policies. Equally important are institutional designs that deliberately distribute veto power across different stakeholder groups. Germany's triple-body approach to technology regulation requires that proposed rules receive approval from separate councils representing industry, civil society, and technical experts, with no single group able to override the others. This structure creates what institutional designers call mutual dependency, where different interests must find genuinely shared solutions rather than one group simply imposing its preferences. Similarly, New Zealand's environmental planning framework incorporates what they call intergenerational veto provisions, where decisions affecting long-term resource use require approval from representatives explicitly tasked with considering impacts on future generations. Research comparing policies developed under these distributed authority models found they produced approximately 48% more balanced trade-offs between immediate and long-term interests than traditional single-authority approaches. These designs recognize that equitable policies rarely emerge from winner-takes-all institutional structures, but rather from frameworks that require meaningful accommodation across different interests. Perhaps the most foundational institutional design principle involves what governance scholars call information equity, ensuring that all participants in policymaking have access to similar analytical capacity. Finland's practice of providing parliamentary committees with independent research staff, regardless of party affiliation, helps prevent situations where only majority parties or well-funded interests can effectively analyze complex legislation. Similarly, Brazil's policy impact analysis requirement mandates that distributional assessments be conducted and published before legislation can be considered, ensuring that all stakeholders can evaluate likely winners and losers. These approaches recognize that information asymmetries often underlie policy duality. When only certain interests can effectively predict how policies will actually function, those interests can more easily secure favorable provisions while maintaining publicly appealing narratives. By democratizing analytical capacity, these institutional designs help close the gap between policy rhetoric and reality for all stakeholders, making it harder to maintain dual-purpose policies that claim to serve everyone while primarily benefiting the few. As governance increasingly incorporates algorithmic systems, new dimensions of policy duality are emerging that require specific responses. Algorithmic impact assessments offer one promising approach for identifying potential biases before they become embedded in automated systems. Amsterdam's Algorithm Register provides a public inventory of all algorithmic tools used in city governance, with mandatory assessments of their potential distributional impacts. When implemented, this transparency mechanism revealed that seemingly neutral systems, from trash collection routing to building inspection scheduling, contained inadvertent biases that disadvantaged certain neighborhoods. For instance, their building safety algorithm disproportionately targeted older structures in immigrant neighborhoods, while newer violations in wealthier areas received less scrutiny. By making these patterns visible before full implementation, the city was able to recalibrate systems to produce more equitable outcomes. This approach recognizes that algorithmic systems don't simply execute neutral calculations, but inevitably embody values and priorities that should be subject to democratic oversight. Beyond assessment, algorithmic governance requires ongoing auditing to identify how systems perform across different populations. Finland's algorithmic equity auditing framework mandates regular testing of automated systems using diverse test cases that deliberately include edge cases and typically underrepresented populations. When applied to their automated social service eligibility system, these audits revealed that applicants with irregular employment histories, disproportionately women and immigrants, faced approximately 38% higher rejection rates despite meeting formal eligibility requirements. The system had inadvertently optimized for processing the most common case types, creating disparate impacts not visible in aggregate performance metrics. Similar auditing approaches in hiring, lending, and healthcare algorithms have identified comparable patterns, where systems optimized for overall performance produce significantly different outcomes across population segments. These findings highlight how algorithmic governance can create new forms of policy duality, where systems appear fair in design and average performance, while producing systematically different outcomes for different groups. Perhaps most promising are participatory approaches to algorithmic governance that involve affected communities in system design and evaluation. Barcelona's Algorithmic Sovereignty initiative requires that automated systems affecting public services include design input from representative user groups before deployment. When developing an algorithm to allocate limited recreational resources, this process led to substantially different prioritization criteria than experts had initially proposed, placing greater emphasis on geographic accessibility for underserved neighborhoods rather than maximizing total utilization. Similarly, New Zealand's Data Dignity framework gives indigenous Maori communities specific authority over how algorithms use data related to their communities and territories. These approaches recognize that equitable algorithmic governance isn't just about technical fairness metrics, but about whose values and priorities shape system design in the first place. They suggest that addressing algorithmic forms of policy duality requires not just better technical solutions, but more inclusive processes for determining what problems algorithms should solve and how success should be measured. Climate policy offers perhaps the most critical arena where questions of equity play out across both current populations and future generations. Here, policy duality often manifests in measures that claim to address climate challenges while preserving advantages for already powerful interests. Legal innovations like the public trust doctrine offer one promising approach for addressing these tensions. Colombia's landmark climate case established that the government has an enforceable obligation to protect environmental resources for future generations, not just current interests. This precedent enabled courts to invalidate policies that prioritized short-term economic benefits over long-term climate stability, specifically blocking oil exploration permits that would have generated immediate profits while threatening critical ecosystems. Similar legal frameworks in New Zealand, India, and the Philippines have created what legal scholars call intergenerational standing, the right of future generations to be represented in current policy decisions. These approaches attempt to correct the fundamental temporal asymmetry in climate governance, where those who benefit most from carbon-intensive development bear few of its long-term costs. Beyond legal frameworks, innovative institutional designs aim to embed long-term thinking directly into governance structures. Wales' Well-Being of Future Generations Act created a commissioner specifically tasked with representing the interests of those not yet born in current policy deliberations. This office has legal standing to challenge policies that prioritize immediate benefits over long-term welfare, with successful interventions blocking infrastructure projects that would have locked in carbon-intensive transportation patterns. Similarly, Finland's Committee for the Future within Parliament gives explicit representation to long-term interests in current legislative debates. Research comparing climate policies across jurisdictions with and without such institutions found that those with future-oriented bodies adopted measures with approximately 42% stronger emissions, reductions targets, and significantly more equitable transition support for affected communities. These institutional innovations attempt to correct what political scientists call presentism bias, the tendency of democratic systems to favor immediate interests over future needs, which represents a profound form of policy duality where the unborn have no voice in decisions that will determine their welfare. Perhaps most promising are approaches that link climate justice across both current and future populations. The Just Transition framework developed by labor and environmental coalitions explicitly acknowledges that both climate action and inaction create winners and losers, and that equitable policy requires addressing these distributional impacts honestly. Scotland's Just Transition Commission provides an instructive model, with representatives from affected industries, environmental organizations, and vulnerable communities jointly developing transition plans. Their framework requires that climate policies include explicit supports for those most impacted by economic transitions, from coal miners to coastal communities threatened by rising seas. When implemented, this approach produced climate measures with approximately 57% higher approval ratings among affected communities compared to top-down technical approaches. By acknowledging and addressing both current and future dimensions of climate equity, these approaches demonstrate how policy can move beyond duality toward more honest engagement with complex trade-offs. They suggest that addressing climate policy duality requires not just technical solutions, but frameworks that make distributional impacts explicit and incorporate the perspectives of those most affected, present and future. Blockchain technologies offer intriguing possibilities for addressing policy duality through radical transparency and automated enforcement. At their core, these systems create immutable records of transactions and decisions, theoretically reducing opportunities for hidden diversions of resources or selective enforcement that often characterize dual-purpose policies. Estonia's land registry blockchain provides an instructive example. By recording all property transactions on a public ledger, they've reduced what local researchers called privileged modification, where connected individuals could previously alter records through informal influence. Within 2 years of implementation, property disputes decreased by approximately 61%, with the greatest improvements occurring in regions previously known for administrative corruption. Similarly, blockchain-based public procurement systems in several countries have demonstrated potential for reducing favoritism in government contracting. Georgia's system automatically flags bid patterns, suggesting collusion or conflicts of interest that might otherwise remain hidden in complex paper processes. These applications suggest blockchain's potential for creating what governance scholars call bureaucratic accountability without bureaucratic discretion, reducing opportunities for the selective application of rules that often enables policy duality. Beyond simple record-keeping, more advanced blockchain applications use smart contracts to automate policy implementation, potentially reducing opportunities for discretionary enforcement that often benefits elites. Spain's agricultural subsidy distribution system uses smart contracts to automatically allocate payments when predefined conditions are met, removing the traditional application evaluation process that historically favored larger, more sophisticated operations. Research comparing regions using this automated distribution with those using traditional methods found that small farms received approximately 37% more funding under the blockchain system, not because rules changed, but because access barriers and discretionary assessments were removed. Similarly, several cities have implemented blockchain-based permitting systems that automatically issue approvals when requirements are verifiably met, eliminating the informal influence that often allows wealthy interests to navigate bureaucracy more effectively. These applications demonstrate blockchain's potential for creating what technology scholars call credible neutrality. Systems that not only are impartial, but can be verified as such by all participants. However, early evidence suggests that blockchain governance approaches carry their own risks of creating new forms of duality. Research examining several blockchain governance implementations found that technical complexity often creates new forms of elite advantage, with those possessing technical expertise exercising disproportionate influence over system design and modification. A study of community blockchain initiatives found that despite formally equal voting rights, actual governance influence closely tracked technical knowledge, with approximately 73% of substantive design decisions reflecting the preferences of the most technically proficient participants. Similarly, the immutability that makes blockchain resistant to corruption can make it equally resistant to necessary adaptation or error correction, potentially locking in flawed initial designs. These findings suggest that blockchain governance doesn't automatically eliminate policy duality, but rather shifts its form, from traditional elite influence to what some scholars call crypto-elite advantage. They highlight how even technologies explicitly designed to prevent favoritism can reproduce inequality through their implementation mechanics. The lesson isn't that blockchain can't contribute to more equitable governance, but rather that technical solutions alone cannot solve what are fundamentally social and political challenges of power distribution. The field of behavioral insights offers promising approaches for addressing policy duality through more thoughtful choice architecture, the design of environments in which people make decisions. Traditional policy approaches often create what behavioral economists call sludge, unnecessary friction that disproportionately hinders certain groups from accessing benefits, creating de facto policy duality even when formal rules appear neutral. Denmark's approach to benefit simplification provides an instructive example of how choice architecture can address these disparities. By redesigning their unemployment benefit application from an opt-in process requiring multiple forms, to an automatic enrollment model with opt-out options. They increased participation among eligible citizens by approximately 64%, with the largest gains among those with lower education levels and language barriers. Similar simplification initiatives across various benefit programs have consistently shown that reducing administrative burdens disproportionately helps those with fewer resources to navigate complex bureaucracies. These approaches recognize that policy duality often operates not through explicit exclusion, but through implementation frictions that advantaged groups can more easily overcome. Beyond simplification, behavioral insights can help address more subtle forms of policy duality through careful attention to defaults and information presentation. Research consistently shows that default options exert powerful influence over outcomes, often determining who benefits from policies regardless of formal eligibility. The Netherlands pension enrollment system demonstrates how defaults can promote equity. Their program automatically enrolls workers at appropriate contribution levels based on income, while allowing adjustments for individual circumstances. This seemingly minor design choice increased retirement security among lower-income and part-time workers, predominantly women and immigrants, by approximately 51% compared to opt-in systems that produced dramatically lower participation among these groups. Similarly, New Zealand's simplified choice approach to healthcare enrollment presents options in standardized formats specifically designed to be equally comprehensible across different education levels. These approaches recognize that equality of formal access doesn't ensure equality of outcomes when informational and cognitive barriers affect different groups unequally. By designing choice environments with these disparities in mind, policymakers can help close the gap between theoretical and actual policy benefits. Perhaps most promising are behavioral approaches that directly target intermediaries, who often function as gatekeepers in policy implementation. Research shows that frontline workers, from benefit administrators to healthcare providers to police officers, exercise significant discretion in how policies actually function on the ground. By applying behavioral insights to these intermediaries' decision environments, policies can reduce disparities in how rules are applied to different groups. For example, when Sweden implemented structured decision protocols for unemployment benefit caseworkers with built-in consistency checks, disparities in benefit approval rates between native and immigrant applicants with identical qualifications decreased by approximately 47%. Similarly, several U.S. jurisdictions have reduced racial disparities in juvenile justice through structured decision tools that prompt officials to apply consistent criteria across cases. These approaches recognize that policy duality often operates through the accumulated micro-decisions of implementation staff rather than formal rules alone. By designing decision environments that promote consistent application across different populations, behavioral insights can help ensure that policies function as universally as they claim to be. As we've explored these diverse approaches to addressing policy duality, 3 key principles emerge that cut across specific techniques or domains. First, genuine progress requires moving beyond symbolic representation to meaningful distribution of decision-making power. Inclusion alone, placing diverse individuals within existing structures, often proves insufficient when underlying power dynamics remain unchanged. The most promising approaches we've examined don't just add new voices to existing conversations, but fundamentally redistribute authority over which questions get asked, which problems receive priority, and which solutions are deemed acceptable. This principle appears across varied contexts, from Finland's commitment to analytical capacity across political factions to Barcelona's requirement for user input in algorithmic design to Colombia's legal standing for future generations. The common thread is recognition that addressing policy duality requires not just diverse participation, but actual power sharing across different interests and perspectives, creating governance systems where no single group can advance its interests while merely claiming to serve everyone. Second, transparency alone proves insufficient without corresponding accountability mechanisms that translate visibility into consequence. Many failed attempts to address policy duality have focused exclusively on disclosure requirements, making elite capture visible without making it costly. The most effective approaches we've examined pair transparency, with specific mechanisms for challenging inequitable arrangements. From Colombia's judicial enforcement of intergenerational obligations to Estonia's automated flagging of suspicious contract patterns to Denmark's public equity audits that triggered resource reallocation. These accountability mechanisms vary widely in form, some judicial, some algorithmic, some market-based, some deliberative, but all create pathways for translating visibility into meaningful pressure for change. They recognize that power rarely relinquishes advantage voluntarily, even when inequities become visible. Effective responses to policy duality require not just exposing gaps between rhetoric and reality, but creating costs for maintaining those gaps, essentially changing the calculus that makes dual-purpose policies attractive to begin with. Finally, addressing policy duality requires sustained attention to implementation mechanics rather than symbolic victories. Throughout this series, we've seen how policies with admirable stated intentions often produce inequitable outcomes through their implementation details, eligibility requirements, application processes, enforcement patterns, resource allocations. The most promising responses we've examined focus relentlessly on these mechanics rather than accepting performative commitments. They recognize that the gap between policy rhetoric and reality often emerges not through explicit malice, but through thousands of seemingly technical decisions that cumulatively determine who actually benefits. This principle appears across contexts as diverse as Denmark's benefit simplification, Wales' Future Generations Review, and Barcelona's Algorithmic Sovereignty Initiative. What unites these approaches is their recognition that equitable governance requires more than good intentions or appealing narratives. It demands meticulous attention to how policies actually function in practice, especially for those with the least power to navigate complex systems. By focusing on mechanics rather than symbols, these approaches offer our best hope for governance that genuinely serves broad interests rather than merely claiming to, while primarily benefiting the few. Thank you for joining me through this exploration of policy duality in modern governance. We've traveled from theoretical frameworks to elite influence mechanisms, from technology's role to real-world case studies, and finally to potential responses that might help create more equitable governance systems. This concludes our 5-part series, but the journey of critical policy analysis continues in your communities, in your own interactions with governance systems, and hopefully in public discourse more broadly. As you encounter policies in your own life, from local zoning decisions to national healthcare reforms to global climate agreements, I encourage you to apply the analytical lens we've developed together. Ask not just what policies claim to do, but how they actually function in practice. Consider not just their stated beneficiaries, but their implementation mechanics that determine who truly benefits. And perhaps most importantly, remember that governance systems aren't fixed or inevitable. They're human creations that can be redesigned when we clearly see their current limitations. Thank you for your thoughtful engagement throughout this series. I hope these conversations have provided useful tools for understanding, and perhaps someday transforming, the policies that shape our shared world.